I think a lot of people just sort of hit a point and they tend to coast a little bit. And we all have those moments. But again, the idea is to keep moving forward, keep acquiring information, keep developing. You're always going to have periods where you just feel like an idiot. And then there's going to be those days where you just, as we would say here, knock it out of the park. So they come and they go. The idea, though, is that as you evolve, you get better at managing probability. The planes are great. If you want to talk levers and pulleys and straight stuff, and you want to calculate forces in 2 dimensions, by all means, go there. It's not accurate, okay, but it does give you a representation. That's why some people get to go to the Olympics, is because the gods turn their physical structure into something superhuman that allows them to do things that other people just can't do. You're never going to turn a weakness into a strength. You can develop potential, but when you find your strengths, that's where you would start to invest heavily. You develop those strengths to their ultimate capabilities, and then that's where you get to stand out. If we say that this is correct, and then we have this cascade of events that is based off of the inferior model, then we get farther and farther away from the reality.
Welcome to this new episode. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsor for the podcast, Moxy Monitor. If you've been following my work, you know that the Moxy is a tool that I use a lot for testing, but also for everyday training and coaching. For those who don't know about the Moxy Monitor yet, it's a NIRS device that measures muscle oxygen saturation and blood volume in real time. It's a non-invasive sensor that is placed on the skin and can be worn during any training or sporting activity. Motocross riders and climbers wear it on their forearms. Hockey players on the ice, swimmers can wear it in water. I've used it to test rugby players, CrossFit athletes, endurance athletes, and more. The Moxy allows you to individualize work and rest periods, optimize load, reps and sets, identify training thresholds in real time, and even correct movement based on what the data shows you. You can also use the Moxy Monitor to determine an athlete's energetic limiting factor and their individual training zones. Using this process, I can now target the athlete's limiter with precision in order to improve their performance without adding unnecessary volume to their program. You can view and collect the data on your Garmin watch, and can also pair the Moxy with other physiological testing products such as the VO2 Master, Pnoe, and Cosmed VO2 systems. The Moxy is a product I've been using for many months with great success, and I highly recommend it to any coach who's interested in digging a little bit deeper on the physiological side of health, fitness, or performance. You can use the coupon UPSIDE at checkout for a 5% discount on moxymonitor.com/shop. That's UPSIDE, UPSIDE, for a 5% discount. With that said, let's get into the show. All right, Bill, we're live on the podcast. How you doing, man?
I'm awesome.
As always.
As always.
It's great to have you on. It's a real pleasure. I've been following your work for some time now, and kind of secondhand from some of the other guys that swear by your work, Pat Davidson, and Justin Moore, and others. First of all, I wanted to say I have a tremendous amount of respect for everything you've done so far in the field, and what you still bring daily to everybody. And I think people that aren't following you yet should. But maybe to let you talk a little bit, can you maybe tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you start in the field? Why did you get into coaching, physical therapy?
Didn't have anything else to do. True story. I was working on a master's degree in exercise physiology, and it was looking like it was going to be a dead end because I didn't have an interest in pursuing a PhD. And I didn't enjoy being a lab rat, so I was spending hour upon hour in the exercise phys lab. And at the time, the big topic of concern was exercise or excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, right? So we were doing a lot of long duration, like 3 hours at a time, doing resting metabolic rates, training people, and then putting them back into the little cabinet and letting them sit there for another 3 hours. And if you've ever gone through a test like that, you're not allowed to do anything. So you can't watch TV, you can't read a book, you literally have to just sit there. Actually, back in the old days, we would lay there with your head inside of a plastic box. And
it's pretty intense.
So it was getting really old and really boring. and had interest in exercise, movement, etc. And it's like, okay, well, what can I do with this? And so it stood to reason that, okay, well, I'll just go to physical therapy school, and that appears to be something that would be somewhat related.
Mhm.
And so that's what I did, and then just slowly evolved over the last 30 years, basically, to get me to this point.
Did you ever figure out if you had a certain way that you preferred learning, or did your learning process evolve over time?
I think everybody's learning process evolves over time if you want it to. Um, I was introduced to a way to acquire and accumulate and organize information very early on, actually in high school. I'll give credit to Sylvia Meyer. She was my English teacher in high school, and she taught which would probably fall into the category. Are you familiar with Zettelkasten?
I am not.
It is. So it's a very old school way to accumulate and organize information. And so she taught me a note card system where you keep track of sources and bits of information, and everything's organized into this gigantic file system. So you can actually do this on a computer now, but I can't seem to grasp it because I'm old, and so I use paper, pens, and note cards. But you can still, it's the same thing. It's like just how your brain is organized, basically. And so I keep track of sources, and then bits of information, everything kind of gets organized and falls into a category. And so you kind of keep track that way over time. And if you pay attention, and you can evolve this system on your own, whatever you're comfortable with. And it's just a matter of, again, just paying attention and wanting to get better. I think a lot of people just sort of hit a point and they tend to coast a little bit. And we all have those moments, but again, the idea is to keep moving forward, keep acquiring information, keep developing filters. So because the problem that we have now is that information is so prolific and free that it's hard to tell what's good and what's bad, or what's necessary or what's useful. And that's where people run into problems, is that they don't develop the filtering systems to say, okay, this isn't really that helpful. This is a regurgitation of someone else's work, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that everybody evolves something if they're willing to do the work. It takes time, and it takes effort, and it takes consistency, but I think everybody finds their own way.
Yeah, just like everything else, you have to work at it if you want to get better at it, and learning is no different.
Yeah, everybody wants like the secret sauce or the secret system, and the reality is that you might be able to acquire some principles here and there from other people, but the reality is you've got to find out what works for you, and that requires a great deal of failures, misery, discomfort, right? And it goes with it. And some people aren't willing to do that. They want success right now, rather than recognizing the fact that the people that are the most successful are the people that put in the time and the effort and gained the experience and did it the hard way, because there is only the hard way. There is very few that sort of knock it out of the park early on by accident. They come across something that works very, very quickly. It's very rare that happens.
What are some of the filters that you've added most recently, and that you maybe think you could have done with in the past? Something that you were maybe missing as a filter, and that really serves you well now?
I tell you what's really, really powerful to recognize is that if a man came up with the idea and the concept, it's probably wrong. And it was a shortcut. Well, hang on. This is useful. This is useful. We deal with so much complexity, but complexity arises. And if you read like Mandelbrot's fractal representations, and he has this great quote, is like, the greatest complexity arises from simple rules repeated, something to that effect, right? And so the things that we look at or think that we recognize that seem terribly complex arose from something that was much, much simpler. But early on, and I pick on anatomy a lot in this case because of the way that things got named and how it created distractions and took everybody off the wrong course. Is they were looking at, obviously, dead guys, and they literally gave names to things as they figured out what they were, and they were wrong a lot, because they didn't know what they were looking at. They didn't know how to name things, and so again, they created a course of thought that took people away from a very strong foundational premise, is that everything repeats. And instead of saying that, oh, this is like this, they said, this is different from this, because they gave it a different name, and they said it does a different thing, when the reality is that there's a lot of stuff that does the same thing. And so again, this is humans looking at complexity and saying, this is so different, when the reality is, it's like, no, it's so similar, you just didn't look deep enough. And so that's something that we all need to recognize, is that on the superficial level, these things that are things, they just seem so amazing and so impossible to figure out. It's like, okay, but wait a minute, what does this look like? Where did this come from? And then a lot of times we can determine, oh, this is just like this. It just looks a little different because of the layers of complexity that were applied with the same rule that started this whole process. It just started from different initial conditions. And then that's why it looks a little different at the end. And so, I'm not picking on those people, because they were doing the best they can. But, if you're doing dissections with a wooden spoon and an elbow, how qualitative are those things going to be? And so they looked at things a certain way. And then you look at the way that we can look at anatomy now with our capabilities and understanding of things. It's like, it's much more useful and much more detailed, and we probably need to rethink some of those things. So, to sort of summarize that, it's like, don't just take someone's word for it that this is how it is, because we have a lot of good information that's available to us if we look for it, that will provide us guidance towards those foundational principles and those simple rules.
Yeah. So not only do we have those kind of errors built into the cake, but we also have the idea that the model is never going to be reality in and of itself, because it is a representation. There are some shortcuts that have to be made in order to simplify things so we can model it, because we cannot model reality itself, right?
We have to rely on models, because again, because the layer upon layer upon layer upon layer, right? And so the chances of us ever truly understanding something are pretty slim, at least within a lifetime. I think, thousands of years from now, I would hope that they would be a heck of a lot smarter than we are now, because they get to start from a much higher level. And the prolific nature of the availability of information is going to just continue on. But again, that goes back to the importance of having filters to look at these things, because we can't just take things at face value. And that's a bit of a problem when we talk about our industry as a whole, is because the barrier to entry is not very high. And so then you get people that are looking for something, and then they'll latch on to the first thing that gives them a sense of certainty. And this is all uncertain, and that's very difficult to grasp early on, because you're just hoping and looking for something that you can use with great confidence, so you can effectively work with another human being. And the unfortunate circumstance, and or maybe the fortunate circumstance, is that as you mature and you grow in the industry, you start to realize, oh yeah, we don't know anything.
Yeah,
it's like,
that's actually a point that I've been struggling with. I remember, when I started coaching 7-8 years ago, I knew everything, right? And I had I had a very narrow background I played some rugby when I was younger. I played some other sports, but then I did a bit of CrossFit, a bit of weightlifting. And so barbells were, cure cancer, and everybody should back squat, and dumbbells are for losers, and all the things that followed. Obviously, I was probably wrong on all the things that I thought I knew. And now as I move forward, I feel like I go through cycles of sometimes feeling like I have a good grasp, a good understanding of a given topic. And then some other times where I literally feel like I really don't understand anything. I even question my own capabilities. Am I actually, good enough to do that work given how little I understand and I know? So how do you manage, or have you ever experienced those ebbs and flows, and how do you manage them as you go along?
You mean every day? No, there's gonna be moments in time where you have those aha, periods where everything just seems to kind of fall into place and everything starts to make sense. and then you capture another piece of information, and you compare that to what you think you know, and it either directs you, it continues in that same direction, or it's going to redirect your thought process if you're willing to recognize the fact that you're going to have this horrible cognitive bias that's going to evolve over time. The better you get at that, the stronger your biases become, and they become more and more difficult to overcome. But if you can remain the student and humble yourself, to the fact that you're never going to know everything. Some things are useful at certain times, and some things are not useful at certain times. And that's where these arguments between these groups that exist, some way, shape, or form, that people will associate themselves with, and they go back and forth all the time. It's like, no, this is the right answer, and it's like, no, this is the right answer, and they don't recognize the fact that both of them are right. It just depends on the context, and so you're always going to have periods where you just feel like an idiot. And then there's going to be those days where you just, as we would say here, knock it out of the park. So they come and they go. The idea, though, is that as you evolve, you get better at managing probability because of the uncertainty, right? And so, we have interns that come into IFAST all the time, and, they come in as, not to be insulting, young skulls full of mush. It's like they have all this stuff that's floating around in their head. They don't know how to organize it. They don't know how to filter that information. And again, they're just grasping for something that's useful, and they want to know. And then as they start to see how we do the work, they recognize the fact that we don't know what the outcome is going to be either. It's just that we've seen so many different things that we're able to narrow down the probability in our favor. So the way I always explain it is like, I've had more representations of somebody doing a split squat than somebody that's been in the field for 3 years. I've seen more of them. And that alone gives me a stronger representation of what I'm looking for, or what I expect under certain circumstances. And so 82% of the time, I might be right. 18% of the time, I'm going to be wrong. Whereas in their world, it's flip-flopped. 18% of the time they're going to be right. 82% of the time they're going to be wrong. But that's just the reality. That's the reality of how you evolve as a professional. And they just need to understand that. But it never goes away. It never goes away. I have a buddy that's a plastic surgeon, PhD. Like he's like way up there in intellect. And he sat in the purple room with me as I'm treating people, just so he can observe and see what happens. And I always tell him, it's like, I have no idea what the outcome's going to be until it arises. And he goes, no, you don't. You know exactly what's going to happen. It's like, no, I truly don't. I just think that I'm playing better probability. So I'm a better poker player, to quote Annie Duke. It's like, I'm playing poker, not chess. Like chess is very, very systematic in its approach. There's some creativity certainly, but poker is all probability. And so that's what I'm doing when I'm in the purple room. But like I said, there's always moments where your confidence is like, I don't know enough. Or you have the day, I always make a joke that I have a scar on my forehead where I bang my head on my steering wheel as I drive home because I had such a lousy cognitive day, and that still happens. It always happens. It never goes away.
Yeah. And I like the idea of probability, and maybe in my mind, what it reminds me of is maybe this idea that we need to move away from those yes, no, black, white, and move into the middle, and then play with the dial and try to adjust that dial. Instead of adjusting it all the way to the left, all the way to the right, it's going to be somewhere in the between. We just need to be more precise about where that dial actually falls. And like you said, update that placement over time to reflect what we go through, what our experience is, and what other information we can bring into our model.
Right. This is where I would fault some of the formal education that we're all exposed to, is that there always has been a correct answer on the test, right? When the reality is like in the real world, there could be multiple correct answers. So what we would call successful in regards to an interaction, it's like, how many measures of success could there have been, right? So we see one outcome when we know that there were multiple outcomes that were possible. And we pat ourselves in the back for the successful outcome, when the reality was, it's like, yeah, it was favorable in regards to the outcome, but was it the actual best possible outcome? Like, was there something that could have been better? And this comes back to your process as to how you do manage these interactions. It's like we have to rely on a process. We don't look at these things as success being good, failure being bad. We just have to look at these things as the outcome, because that's where we're going to learn. And so again, this is another way that we look at these pieces of information, and we have to ask the same questions. When we perceive ourselves to have a moment of success, we have to look at this and ask the same questions, like, okay, what did I do? What actually happened? What could have happened? What could I have done better in this circumstance? What could have been the better outcome? And then that, again, helps us see what the possibilities are and allows us to narrow the probabilities in the next interaction.
Going back to your statement about anatomy and dead guy anatomy and its limitations, what is if you had to give a primer for people that haven't been exposed to your model, what is your current understanding of internal dynamics when it comes to movement?
Well, you mean the fact that it's been underappreciated?
Yes, this, and then for people who've never maybe heard about the concept of internal dynamics, what it actually is.
Well, okay, so you're a big bag of water. Let's just make it really, really simple. Okay, you're a big bag of water. And if you've ever, like, so we actually have these as tools in the gym now, where we have the big water bags and stuff. Mm-hmm. Like, all you got to do is swing one of those big water bags around. It's like that's happening inside of you all the time. And so that force that is produced has to be accounted for, because number one, it allows you to do amazing things like walk on two legs, throw a baseball 95 miles an hour, jump really, really high. Like those internal dynamics contribute to our ability to perform. They are also detrimental to performance. And so if we can understand a little bit more about how those internal forces interact with our ability to manage them in an environment that is based on gravity and space and the external forces that we have to manage, if we can understand that we have stuff going on the inside, stuff going on the outside, it provides us a better representation of reality. Again, we can't see it, but we can get close to it, right? And it allows us to make better decisions in regards to our interactions. So it'll get us away from the things that just appear to be entirely superficial. And so when you see somebody, like we would have like say a volleyball player doing a box jump, they jump off a box and they land, and there's a certain way that they land. And so some people will go, oh, she has weak this, right? When we see something happen, when you see somebody's knees moving down and inward as they land a jump, they say, oh, she has a weak something. And it's like, well, actually, when you hit the ground like that, your guts come second. Your body falls first, your guts follow, right? Because they float, right? And so when you hit, there's another hit that's coming. And if you don't manage that, you have to be able to capture that force as well. So it's where people use these strong versus weak representations. If we can understand that, oh, we have management of internal forces that, again, are beneficial or detrimental depending on our perspective and depending on what we're observing in context. If we can learn how to manage those more effectively, again, our decision-making process is much more accurate and then much more useful.
And so when talking about those internal dynamics and forces that we have to manage, what are the primary strategies that we as coaches and maybe therapists for you and others have access to in order to try and influence what's going on at that level?
Well, it doesn't change the tools that we use. It doesn't change the activities that we use. What it changes is the perspective that allows you to make a better decision under the circumstance. So the things that we have always seen, for instance, if I have a young athlete that's working on some form of agility, like an outside foot cut or something to that effect, and I see them plant, and instead of moving into and out of the cut on essentially the same angle, I see them move into the cut, and then I see their center of gravity go up. Okay, so if you ever watch a wave crash against the rocks on a rocky shore, you see the water hit the rock and it goes up. Okay, well, guess what? If you're a big bag of water, you got water inside of you that moves just like that wave, slams into the side of your body, and it hits the constraint and it goes up. So instead of being able to take that force and reorganize it and turn it in the other direction to our advantage, now we have a situation where we have somebody that's not managing the force the way we would want to. And so now we have to make a decision as to how that happens. So rather than picking on someone and saying, oh, you just have a weak something, we have to say, okay, why is he unable to manage this big wave that's crashing into the rocks? And why is it going up? Instead of him learning how to capture it, use it in his turn, and to reorganize and make the change in the other direction. So again, it just helps us select the best intervention under the circumstance by understanding that why do we have this observation in the first place? It's like this is coming from the inside. This is not a weak muscle that is not stopping. Because let's go back to our little filter about if man decided that it was called this, it's probably not that. It's like muscles are a man-made concept. It's like the separation of them is our decision, so we could manage the complexity, because we say that this area we're going to call this muscle, and the one that's right next to it, that's one muscle fiber away, suddenly becomes another muscle. And that's not reality either.
How do you deal with that aspect of things? Do you still talk about different muscle groups, or do you?
Yeah, I can speak that language too. It's again, there's times where things are useful. There's times to talk about points in space where we talk about 3 dimensions. It's useful. It just doesn't really apply itself well when it comes to how we actually move. When we talk about the way that everything in the universe moves is based on the construction of a gradient. If there's no gradient, there is absolutely no movement. And so it's like, then you look at humans, you say, well, if that's the rule, how do we do it? And then that's just a matter of figuring out how we do it. And then you start to look at anatomy totally differently. You stop looking at these individual representations of muscles, and you go, oh, I just have this relationship that is taking place. And as I manage these internal and external forces, and then the muscles kind of disappear a little bit. It gets a little blurry in regards to the separation between one spot and the other. And you kind of see how this literally a flow occurs through our body as to how we manage these forces and then produce movement. But again, at times it's okay to go, well, they called it this at one point in time. Let's localize this and say, I want to talk about this area as a representation of producing something so I can understand it. Because again, I'm an idiot. I don't really know a whole lot. Okay. So sometimes I have to go there because that's the way that my foundation was established. Right. And so we can still use it. But it's speaking a little bit of an ancient language to help us understand something in the present.
Is it almost like we went, quote unquote, too far in trying to separate different parts of the body and muscle groups simply because maybe the whole as a complex system was just, we just didn't have the tools to grasp it at the time? Would you say that we kind of went too far?
Well, okay. So think about this for a second. When you think about the most archaic of machines, ropes, pulleys, wheels, levers, right? So if that's the model that you've got constructed in your head as to how movement is produced in the world, and then you take a dead guy and you look at him and you go, oh, this moves just like a pulley. This moves just like a lever. And dead guys do have pulleys and levers. Living humans don't. So it doesn't make it entirely useless, but when it comes to getting a deeper representation, getting closer to what we can perceive as reality, then it starts to lose its luster a little bit. But again, if it gives us a representation to start with, I'm totally cool with that, as long as we continue to move forward.
To come back to that cutting example that you gave and the analogy of the wave crashing and going up, could you give us a glimpse of maybe the next step that you would take in your thinking process? If you see that happening in an athlete, how do you start investigating his movement in order to then determine what course to take and what interventions to apply?
Okay. So everything happens in rotation. Everything. It's like you're basically a giant worm when it comes to how we move and manage things, right? You're a big long tube. Okay. And this goes back to the concept that I use as where did you come from? And so when you look at your evolution of anatomy from an embryological standpoint, you used to be a big giant tube. Guess what? You're still a big giant tube. And so everything occurs in turns and rotations. And so when I see something that takes me away from the ability to turn into or out of, then I know that I have a situation where the turning capability is the limitation, right? So for me to move into a cut, I have to turn a certain direction. For me to move out of a cut, I have to be able to turn in another direction. When I see something that doesn't occur and appears to occur in a straight line, I have to recognize the fact that I no longer have turning capabilities. Well, there is a representation of structure and position where turning actually stops. And so under those circumstances, I have somebody that is either incapable of producing the turn, or they're staying in that position that stops the turn too long. So very, very simple representation. And that in my terminology, that would fall into the category of a middle propulsive representation. So this is when we're applying force into the ground. So if I have somebody that has to sustain that middle propulsive representation, so they can't shorten it fast enough, but they can capture it, but they hold on to it too long, then the turning capability stops, and then the wave crashes, and then the wave drives whatever the resultant would be, which is usually something that happens in a straight line. Mm-hmm. So that's a very simple explanation for something that is probably very, very complex.
And you're introducing the idea of gates as one of the ways that we have to, like you said. I mean, one thing that I've heard secondhand. I never took any of the PRI courses, but the breathing is walking, walking is breathing, and the whole concept that, like you said, everything works together and there's rotation in all planes, no matter what you do. Even though we say we work something in the sagittal plane, we're really not. To what extent is it still, again, we talk about usefulness of concepts and models, to what extent is it still useful to use planes of movement? If you had to steelman the idea of planes of motion and movement, where would you keep applying them, and then where would you kind of try to make away with them?
If you need to identify a point in space, using the Cartesian coordinates is very, very useful. So that's an XYZ axis, right? So that's a three-dimensional representation. So we can locate things in space. When it comes to movement, they don't exist because and again, what they did is they tried to say that, oh, humans have this, this orientation, when the reality is we're just shape changers. And so for shape changers, there are no planes, mm-hmm. right? And so again, they just don't exist. Again, if I need to have a discussion with someone and we have to identify an area, a point, or something like that, then it becomes very, very useful. If we're trying to describe movement, not very useful at all.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Again, it's just one of those things that distracts us
from what's actually going on.
Yeah. So if you go 3 degrees off the sagittal plane, right, as someone would identify the sagittal plane, if you go 3 degrees off that plane, right, same point of intersection through the middle of whatever you're representing, right, what do they call that plane? Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
there's no name for it. So why do we have to name anything? Because none of them exist.
Yeah, right. Now you've got everybody confused. Go away scratching there.
All we do is take up space, and then we acquire positions in space, right? That's how we do everything. Mm-hmm. And again, if you need that representation to get you started, I'm totally fine with it. But the deeper you get into how we do things, right? Like the planes are great. If you want to talk levers and pulleys and straight stuff, then and you want to calculate forces in 2 dimensions, by all means, go there. It's not accurate, okay, but it does give you a representation. Mm-hmm. Very useful for building a bridge, not very useful for identifying human movement.
Another thing that I heard, again, secondhand from Pat Davidson, but he mentioned you as the source of that information. And I know you've talked about where you found it, but maybe talk about infrasternal angles and how you first came about that model, if we want to call it that, mm-hmm. and how what place it now takes in the way that you assess human beings.
So this goes back to elimination of planes and your physical structure. So if you're a tube, then you behave like a tube, and tubes behave basically on helices. So all of your movement as a human being is based on rotation, and that rotation occurs on a helical angle. And so what we need then is a representation of how you would produce those turns. And that lends itself to physical structure. So if you think about all the possibilities of angles of helices, your parents basically decided what your helical angles were going to be. And so it's just a matter of having a representation of that for us to calculate our probabilities from. And so you can go back into, I think the earliest representation I have of somebody that was looking at structure in a similar manner was, I think Joel Gothwaite talked about it in 1922. But it goes earlier than that. If you go back into like the A.T. Still literature, which would be late 1800s, in medicine, they didn't have X-rays, they didn't have MRIs, they didn't even have, reasonable medications other than maybe something that would manage pain like opiates and things like that. And so what they were looking for is like, why does this group of people always get sick? And why does this group of people not get sick? Right. And then what they kind of looked at and they said, well, we've got these extreme examples of these physical structures, and some people are just more adaptable than other people. Some people turn this way and some people can turn this way. And then they were looking at these physical structures, and then they kind of leave you hanging. Right. They say, we just kind of know that this type of a person is going to feel this way, and this type of a person is going to feel this way. And if we look at stomach shape, they did that. They looked at the shape of the stomach and they go, well, this type of a person has a stomach that looks kind of like this, and this person has a totally different kind of a stomach. And so then you start to piece this stuff together, and you go, okay, well, I have these representations of behavior that are it's all based off of movement. So everything that we do is based off movement. Your thoughts are movement, your speech is movement, et cetera, et cetera. So you are all designed to move. I think it's Daniel Wolpert has a great TED talk on that, on why you even have a brain. But point being is, so all we're looking for is a representation of the helical angle upon which you behave.
Could you please define a helical angle for people that are maybe
you ever look at a toilet paper roll?
Mm-hmm.
The inner the cardboard part of a toilet paper roll.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's a tube, and then it has the seam around it. That's the helices of the toilet paper roll. So if you start at the seam and you unwind it and you pull it apart, it makes the swirly thing.
Like a spring.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So that's basically how you move. So you move based on that. And so within your movement capabilities, your physical structure has limitations based on how you are physically designed. That's why some people can do some amazing things, and some people are just challenged by gravity every day of their life, right? So we have true superheroes all over the world, and then we have people that are the opposing representation, which is, okay, I would have been food for something else had we lived in a more prehistoric time, right? And so we have this broad scope of representation. But if we can understand the extremes, then we can understand a little bit more about how someone is accomplishing a physical task like movement. But again, so the ISA is just a way to narrow the probabilities as to how this person has the capacity to solve a movement problem in context. Right. And so again, it's just a representation. It is not the end all be all. People jump on the bandwagon because it's novel, and it's not even novel, for gosh sakes. It's like you go back through the literature. They saw differences in structure. Shirley Sarman even talks about it in her book, although she's a little bit again, vague as to its usefulness in regards to the representation, but it's been talked about. It just hasn't been utilized. Like when I constructed the archetypes, like the two extreme archetypes, it's like that was foundational because it's the easiest thing to see in regards to this helical orientation. And then it guides me in my understanding of like, okay, so this person has a wider infrasternal angle. So what does that represent to me? what does that tell me about this person? And then there's a cascade of events that has to come off of those principles. So again, we're going down to foundations. Like, what does this represent? And then I have somebody at the other extreme that has these extreme narrow infrasternal angles. It's like, okay, well, wait a minute. This person and this person look totally different. They physically look different. They have to solve movement issues in two totally different ways. And then what is their capabilities based on that? What does it represent? And so that's in its simplest representation. It's like, it's just a measure of your behavior based on your capabilities, based on physical structure.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not all created equal. Okay. That's why some people get paid.
Mm-hmm.
That's why some people get paid to play games. That's why some people get to go to the Olympics, is because, you know, the gods turn their physical structure into something superhuman that allows them to do things that other people just can't do at all.
That's a good way of putting it. I've heard you relate those different ISA archetypes, let's call them, to rotation and force. Could you explain how maybe those come into play when it comes to this? How does the structure dictate someone's ability to preferentially do one or the other?
Do one or the other what? I'm sorry.
Or do one or the other better if we talk more rotation, if we talk more force
production.
Oh,
I got you. Yeah. So the two extremes, you have a wide ISA archetype. So that's somebody that has a very, very wide angle at the bottom of their rib cage. And then you have the narrow ISA archetype, which somebody has a very narrow angle. And again, we're talking about the extremes here. So these are people that have a bias toward. So it's not an absolute. It's not that they can't do something. It's just that they have a limited capacity to do something, and then they would be better at something else. And so when you have somebody with a wide ISA archetype, you have somebody that is biased towards force production, because that representation is based off of the orientation of the body as it would be forcefully exhaling. So when you think about lifting something heavy, or you're gonna push off the ground to accelerate, or I'm gonna throw something really, really hard, there's a moment in time where I have to be able to squeeze myself very, very tightly to produce the highest possible force in the shortest possible time under most circumstances from a dynamic standpoint. And so those people are really, really good at high force. If I need to sustain it, like a powerlifter would, then that actually helps me do that as well. At the other end of the spectrum, I have the opposing strategy, which would be more of an expansive inhaled representation, which actually allows me to move and turn much more effectively. Whereas if I'm producing high force and I have too much relative motion available to me where I can turn, it dissipates force. It allows me to demonstrate velocity. So it's the after effect of producing the force. If I can restore the ability to produce relative motion, that's where velocity is demonstrated. When I'm producing high force, I don't want movement. And so the wide ISA archetype is much more forceful, much more higher pressure oriented, much more exhalation based. And then the narrows are the opposing strategy. And so that allows a lot of relative motion to be available, which allows them to demonstrate more of their turning capabilities.
That makes sense. What comes to mind when you talk about those archetypes is what Stu McMillan has talked about in terms of the different archetypes in sprinting, where you have the elastic athlete and you have the very reactive athlete, and the one that's more on the force production side of things. If you look at a 200-meter sprinter, for example, is that something that meshes together with your model in terms of have you seen those representation kind of play out in the way that a given athlete will express their capabilities? Let's take sprinting as a not an easy discipline to look at or to interpret, but as a fairly consistent representation of how someone is going to move and produce force.
It's obviously in play, but there's a lot of other things that are also, interacting with the foundational representation of the archetype. So for instance, if I have a high force producer that's got a really, really wide ISA, and he doesn't have a significant gradient within his axial skeleton. So I have to have a pressure related volume-related changeability within the axial skeleton to produce velocity.
Mhm.
And so from a sprinter standpoint, it's like, okay, let's take the world's strongest power lifter, okay, so they can produce the highest force without a time constraint, and let's sprint them against the best sprinter that we've got, okay, and you're going to see two different worlds, right? Both can produce high levels of force. One can produce it, in less than, 0.11 seconds, and the other one needs 10 seconds to produce maximum force because he doesn't have the same gradient potential. So he doesn't have the same rate of change that a sprinter does. So we can't just default to one singular element of their physical structure. There are other things that have to be superimposed upon that. So you will rarely find a wide pelvis sprinter that is highly effective. Doesn't mean they don't exist and they aren't fast, but if you look at the world-class level as the ultimate representation, you're going to see a lot of similarities between body types. And they did a bunch of pictures with Olympians a while back, which was really cool to look at all the different body types depending on the sport. And you could see the consistency within that. The representation I always use is, if you ever watch swimming at the Olympics, and they do the little intro thingy, where they show them up on the blocks and everybody's kind of like shaking out and getting loose and things. It's like if they didn't have different colored swim caps, you wouldn't be able to identify who they were because the body type is so similar and they all look the same. Well, there's a reason for that. Is because that body type works the best under these circumstances. But you're not going to show me a guy that looks like the archetype of a great swimmer. He's not going to be a great sprinter because that body type doesn't work on land. It works great in the water, but horrible on land. So, to sort of answer your question a little bit more directly, it's like, yes, that archetype absolutely matters because it's going to determine what your capabilities are, but there are other things that influence it because, again, we have the gradient problem. We have connective tissue behavior that has to all be present. So you could have the perfect representation of the physical structure and lousy connective tissues, and guess what? You're not going to be fast either.
Is body type as a broad term that we just use to qualify, for example, swimmers versus other disciplines or other athletes? Is that something that is currently used in screening processes to try and orient kids or athletes towards maybe where they could have the highest potential to excel? And if it's not, should it be?
Well, it depends. It's like, how do you feel about the old Soviet sports school system or some of the stuff that happens in the Asian countries where that's what they're trying to do. So they try to identify talent early on and then push them in a specific direction based on that. So that's what that whole premise is based on. And every once in a while, you're going to have that outlier that just doesn't seem to fit, and they can still perform it at a very, very high level. But here in the United States, because of the genetic variety within our population, the cream tends to work its way to the surface pretty early on. So we don't really need that system because the people that are really, really good at things show up very, very quickly. And again, depending on the type of sport or activity, they get represented very early. So gymnastics would be one of those sports where body type matters from the get-go, and it happens very early on. Swimming is very similar. We actually have two swimmers right now that are pretty darn close to Olympic caliber, if not already Olympic caliber, one male, one female. So again, that type of body type shows up very, very quickly, under the circumstances where, somebody that's maybe, something that they would show up in their late teens, early 20s kind of a thing, like, baseball. You tend to get kids that can throw pretty hard in high school, and then they continue to evolve either through the collegiate level or in the early phases of a professional career. So then when they hit their maturity, then they tend to sort of peak in all of their capabilities, not just the throwing velocity. So all this stuff shows up, but you're going to see crazy similarities in body type. It's like, when Usain Bolt kind of broke out and became like the greatest sprinter of all time so far, he sort of made us rethink the rules a little bit as to what would be ideal,
Mhm.
under certain circumstances, because your typical sprinter used to be 5'9", 165, 175 pounds, not 6'5", and having the stride capabilities that he did. So again, but it just goes to show you that, okay, maybe we didn't understand what the absolute law was yet, but we still have these people that fall so close within a range, and that's why they're still really good at what they do.
Mhm. Bill, I've heard you say that you would never have given yourself any client as a young coach or therapist.
Yes.
How can we make sure that young coaches are coaches starting out? How can we make sure that they're as ready as they can be? And if there's no real way of doing that, how can we limit the potential damage that could be done, unfortunately, at that stage?
Yeah. So this falls back on something that I'm kind of fond of talking about, and this is like a mentorship apprenticeship approach. Um, the greater the risk, the more extensive we tend to see apprenticeships. So if you think about like a specialized medical doctor might go through 15 years of evolution until they reach a point where they are considered, an expert of something. Here in the United States, plumbers go through years. Plumbers. So this is not even a complex situation. So plumbers go through years and years of apprenticeship, so they can become a journeyman plumber. And in our industries, it tends to be like, let's get it done as quickly as possible. Let's get them out and get them working. And I don't think it's ideal, and I don't think it's ideal for the client, because again, we have a lot of people that are short on experience taking other people's health into their hands. And rarely do people, suffer dire consequences, but there is potential for it at all times. But it also limits their ability to be successful, right? And so I think that what we probably need to do in our industries is to increase the extent of our ability to have ongoing mentors at different levels of our development. And that's the safest way to do it. And then it's the fastest way to improve the qualification of somebody that becomes a coach or a trainer or a therapist, is to always have that ongoing relationship with again, some level of mentor, or somebody that has skills that you don't have, but that might be helpful for you, is to spend time under the guidance of that person as well. So I think the mentorship apprenticeship model probably needs to be expanded and recognized into its level of importance in something that is, we're a service industry, we work with other human beings, we have consequences to all of our actions, and I think that's the safest way to do it.
Mm-hmm. You talked about adverse consequences that can come from doing certain things. What comes to mind is second order effects, given that we're dealing with a complex system in the human body. So just the quick distinction, complicated, there's a lot of things going on, but it could be theoretically computed. For example, a computer is complicated, but with we can write it all down. We can figure out how it works exactly. The body has emergent properties that we can't necessarily infer from the basic understanding that we have from its component parts. And so when dealing with a complex system like the human body, from your standpoint, what are the biggest second order effects that we neglect, or that we should be thinking about more when we decide to use a certain method of training or a certain intervention? What are the overlooked ones that we need to be conscious of?
Well, so we tend to look at things in a much more acute context. We say that so-and-so did this, nothing bad happened in the moment, right? So it must be okay. And then what we don't recognize is the fact that we may have actually done something that causes a problem 5 years from now. So why do NBA players notoriously end up with arthritic conditions after they retire? Well, because the accumulation of stress over time is what produces the cascade of events that ultimately results in destruction right?
Mhm.
So again, they have superpowers, but those superpowers have to be managed to protect them from themselves. And in many cases, because of the nature of they work a performance schedule, not a play schedule. So they are there to perform for other people, thus the frequency of the exposures, thus the intensity of the effort. And again, they get paid in return, but there are consequences. And so what we have to understand is like all of our I don't want to say average people, but the typical people that we see in sort of the fitness realm, we have to take that into consideration. It's like, I might be doing something to them now that could be detrimental later on. If I'm back squatting somebody, heavy, and yes, they get to be their own guide in that regards. They accept the fact that there's a risk involved, and that's just part of being a grown-up. You get to make those decisions, but the reality is that we are the manager, and we get to make some of those decisions as well as to how we want to influence this. And so I need to protect them from themselves, or I need to protect them from bad decisions. And then the only concern that I have here is that we just don't know what the consequences are going to be.
Mm.
Right? If I back squat somebody heavy today, right? Did I place load on structure that was below the threshold where they would recognize it as having a pain experience, but did I do something to that structure that will have a longer term consequence that won't be identified for a very long time?
Mm.
And so we tend to look at things in this acute representation. It's like, oh, that was safe. When the reality is like, we have to kind of understand, it's like, we probably don't know. And again, we're still playing probabilities here, and that makes people uncomfortable. But it's, like I said, it's probably closer to reality.
Mm-hmm. What is your position on, as a coach and one's development, playing to your strengths rather than to your weaknesses when it comes to looking at what you should, learn next? Where do you need to develop yourself?
Everybody has strengths. Everybody has weaknesses, and your weaknesses will always be weaknesses. Okay. And now, don't confuse the weakness with undeveloped potential. Okay. So, example, I have a guitar sitting in my living room over that way, and I'm terrible. I'm a terrible guitar player. I'm horrible and miserable, right? But I get to call myself a guitar player because I own a guitar and I can noodle a little bit. I'm never going to be a great guitar player. It will always be a weakness of mine. And again, I just don't have the potential to be a great guitar player, nor do I have the time that would be required to do that. So weaknesses will always be weaknesses. That's why it's so important to have a mentor and to go through an apprenticeship model, because I get objectivity that I can't impose upon myself that will help me identify what I'm really, really good at, and then what I might be not so good at, and then that directs me. So we have coaches that are great with general population clients and not so great with athletes. And most likely, it doesn't mean they can't work with athletes. It just means that we got people that are probably better at that. Like, they work better, they understand it better, they have more movement experience, or they've been in that environment, and so they understand more. Whereas you take somebody that's never been in that context and they try to coach that, it becomes very, very difficult, right, to have the best outcome. So again, that all comes into play. You're never going to turn a weakness into a strength. You can develop potential, but again, but when you find your strengths, that's where you would start to invest heavily. You develop those strengths to their ultimate capabilities, and then that's where you get to stand out. Everybody wants to stand out, but they're diluting things by spending too much time on something that's never going to get better. I'm never going to get taller. I'm never going to be a great basketball player, right? Doesn't mean I can't get better at basketball. It just means I'm never going to be a great basketball player, right? So how much time should I invest in that? Well, if I enjoy it, okay, that's fine. But it's like, I'm not going to try out for the Pacers downtown here. I'm never gonna get to play for them. So I'm not going to spend time on that. Okay, but this is why the way you figure this out is you do many things, and you invest a little bit, and you say, okay, am I good at this? Chances are you'll have a moment where you go, okay, I'm pretty good at this. I'm going to stick to it, and I'm going to drive this home. And you tend to like things that you're good at. That's helpful, and it helps you invest your time and your energy appropriately. But that's how you do it. And you'll be wrong sometimes. You'll spend time on the wrong thing. Everybody does, right? But eventually you're going to figure out what you're really, really good at. But if you can have somebody that can help you with that, it reduces the time it takes for you to get there. And again, that's why the mentorship thing is essential.
Mm-hmm. Bill, I've got a couple of shorter questions to end the interview here. First of all, what are some areas of inquiry in the field of fitness, physical performance that, in your opinion, are currently underappreciated and need more investigation?
Oh man, I tell you what, we don't need another article on static stretching. I think we can probably eliminate that from the concern. I would, again, the stuff that I talk about a lot probably needs to be looked at just from a little bit different angle. It's not that there's not information available to it. It's just that putting all of the pieces together as a representation, looking at it a little bit closer as to how the anatomy actually behaves, and recognizing the limitations of the old model. You know, the first dissections on humans were 2,300 years ago. The first really well documented dissections. Not that people have always been curious. I'm sure cavemen were, curious about anatomy, and they would see these horrible injuries and things, and they would be fascinated by them, I'm sure. But I think that, and we're starting to see this. This is actually happening now, where the dissection is getting really crazy good. Mm-hmm. Things that have always been represented as singular muscles are now looking at like, oh, this is probably more than one muscle. So they kind of screwed up when they named it, right? Mm-hmm. So again, I think that's probably, when you think about like foundational representations, foundational models, that's probably where we need to go. Mm-hmm. Because everything's based off of that. And so if that's our thought process, then if we say that this is correct, and then we have this cascade of events that is based off of the inferior model, then we get farther and farther away from the reality, right? Mm-hmm. And then our decision-making capability is affected. So I'd probably say, let's go there.
A question I got from one of your Instagram followers. As you understand it today, what are some of the current limitations to your model?
Me?
Yes.
I am the limitation. I'm the greatest of limitations. Seriously, like, it's true. It's absolutely true. I am the greatest interference of me moving forward. I have a very strong cognitive bias that has evolved over a long period of time. And so there's certain beliefs that I constantly have to manage and challenge. For me to accept something new is very, very difficult. So again, that if there's a limitation, it's going to be me. It's not a limitation on information. It's just a limitation on me processing it, probably more than anything else.
A last question for you, if you're willing to answer it. Why is spectrum green?
Oh man. Okay. So I had dinner with my brother last night, and this comes from us, me and my brother. So there was I can't believe I'm going to tell this. So there was a TV show when we were kids, and it was a super marionette TV show. So it's puppets, right? And the TV show, if you look this up, everybody's going to know this from now on. Okay, so if you go to the TV show called Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons, and the good guys worked for an organization, a worldwide organization that protected the Earth called Spectrum. And instead of saying Roger and out on the radio, they would say Spectrum is green if everything was okay. Mm. And so there was always Spectrum is yellow, their Spectrum is red. So far so good, life's good, Spectrum is green. So that's where that comes from. So now everybody knows.
I love it. I love the message. It's at the end. For those who don't follow yet on Instagram, please, guys and gals, go follow Bill on Instagram and on YouTube, by the way. Some fantastic content on both of those platforms. But your little thoughts on Instagram with Spectrum is Green, and I always wondered what it was. So thanks for sharing that on the podcast.
Yeah.
Maybe
maybe it'll show up now. Like the popularity will rise and they'll bring it back.
Someone might even make a meme out of it with you included.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, that's what we need is more memes.
More memes is definitely what we need. Bill, it was a great pleasure and honor to have you on the podcast today. Where can people find out more about you and what you do?
I do a lot of stuff on the Instagram. So that's Bill Hartman PT on Instagram. I think it's Bill Hartman PT on YouTube as well. My website is billhartmanpt.com. So, I put up a podcast every Sunday. That's basically a weekly review of everything that I've posted. So you can get it in audio form. So basically go to Bill Hartman PT somewhere and you'll probably find me. I think it's on Facebook, same way.
All right. All the links are in the show note description. Again, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. Take care, man.